The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. Author's Preface. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Author's Preface. This story was begun within a few months after the publication of the completed Pickwick Papers. There were then a good many cheap Yorkshire schools in existence. There are very few now. Of the monstrous neglect of education in England, and the disregard of it by the State as a means of forming good or bad citizens and miserable or happy men, private schools long afforded a notable example. Although any man who had proved his unfitness for any other occupation in life was free, without examination or qualification, to open a school anywhere; although preparation for the functions he undertook was required in the surgeon who assisted to bring a boy into the world, or might one day assist perhaps to send him out of it; in the chemist, the attorney, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the whole round of crafts and trades, the schoolmaster excepted; and although schoolmasters, as a race, were the blockheads and impostors who might naturally be expected to spring from such a state of things, and to flourish in it, these Yorkshire schoolmasters were the lowest and most rotten round in the whole ladder. Traders in the avarice, indifference, or imbecility of parents, and the helplessness of children, ignorant, sordid, brutal men, to whom few considerate persons would have entrusted the board and lodging of a horse or a dog, they formed the worthy cornerstone of a structure which for absurdity and a magnificent high-minded laissez-aller neglect has rarely been exceeded in the world. We hear sometimes of an action for damages against the unqualified medical practitioner who has deformed a broken limb in pretending to heal it, but what of the hundreds of thousands of minds that have been deformed for ever by the incapable pettifoggers who have pretended to form them? I make mention of the race, as of the Yorkshire schoolmasters, in the past tense. Though it has not yet finally disappeared, it is dwindling daily. A long day's work remains to be done about us in the way of education, heaven knows, but great improvements and facilities towards the attainment of a good one have been furnished of late years. I cannot call to mind now how I came to hear about Yorkshire schools when I was a not very robust child, sitting in by-places near Rochester Castle, with a head full of partridge, strap, tom pipes, and Sancho Panza; but I know that my first impressions of them were picked up at that time, and that they were somehow or other connected with a suppurated abscess that some boy had come home with in consequence of his Yorkshire guide, philosopher, and friend having ripped it open with an inky penknife. The impression made upon me, however made, never left me. I was always curious about Yorkshire schools, fell, long afterwards and at sundry times, into the way of hearing more about them, at last, having an audience, resolved to write about them. With that intent I went down into Yorkshire before I began this book, in very severe winter time, which is pretty faithfully described herein. As I wanted to see a schoolmaster or two, and was forewarned that those gentlemen might, in their modesty, be shy of receiving a visit from the author of the Pickwick Papers, I consulted with a professional friend who had a Yorkshire connection, and with whom I concerted a pious fraud. He gave me some letters of introduction, in the name, I think, of my travelling companion. They bore reference to a supposititious little boy who had been left with a widowed mother who didn't know what to do with him. The poor lady had thought, as a means of thawing the tardy compassion of her relations in his behalf, of sending him to a Yorkshire school. I was the poor lady's friend, travelling that way, and if the recipient of the letter could inform me of a school in his neighbourhood, the writer would be very much obliged. I went to several places in that part of the country where I understood the schools to be most plentifully sprinkled, and had no occasion to deliver a letter until I came to a certain town which shall be nameless. The person to whom it was addressed was not at home, but he came down at night, through the snow, to the inn where I was staying. It was after dinner, and he needed little persuasion to sit down by the fire in a warm corner, and take his share of the wine that was on the table. I am afraid he is dead now. I recollect he was a jovial, ruddy, broad-faced man, that we got acquainted directly, and that we talked on all kinds of subjects, except the school, which he showed a great anxiety to avoid. "Was there any large school near?" I asked him in reference to the letter. "Oh, yes," he said, "there was a pratty big un." "Was it a good one?" I asked. "Aye," he said, "it was as good as another. That was a matter of opinion," and fell to looking at the fire, staring round the room, and whistling a little. On my reverting to some other topic that we had been discussing, he recovered immediately. But though I tried him again and again, I never approached the question of the school, even if he were in the middle of a laugh, without observing that his countenance fell, and that he became uncomfortable. At last, when we had passed a couple of hours or so, very agreeably, he suddenly took up his hat, and leaning over the table and looking me full in the face, said in a low voice, "Weel, mister, we been vera pleasant together, and I'll spak my mind to thee. Dinnot let the weeder send her lattle boy to yan or our schoolmeasters, while there's a harse to hould in a Lunnon, or a goother to lie asleep in. I wouldn't mak ill words amang my neebours, and I'll speak to thee quiet like. But I'm dommed if I can gang to bed and not tell 'ee, for weeder's sak, to keep the lattle boy from a syke scoundrels, while there's a harse to hould in a Lunnon, or a goother to lie asleep in." Repeating these words with great heartiness, and with a solemnity on his jolly face that made it look twice as large as before, he shook hands and went away. I never saw him afterwards, but I sometimes imagine that I descry a faint reflection of him in John Browdie. In reference to these gentry, I may here quote a few words from the original preface to this book. It has afforded the author great amusement and satisfaction, during the progress of this work, to learn from country friends and from a variety of ludicrous statements concerning himself in provincial newspapers, that more than one Yorkshire schoolmaster lays claim to being the original of Mr. Squeers. One worthy, he has reason to believe, has actually consulted authorities learned in the law, as to his having good grounds on which to rest an action for libel. Another has meditated a journey to London for the express purpose of committing an assault and battery on his traducer. A third perfectly remembers being waited on, last January 12th, by two gentlemen, one of whom held him in conversation while the other took his likeness. And although Mr. Squeers has but one eye, and he has two, and the published sketch does not resemble him, whoever he may be, in any other respect, still he and all his friends and neighbours know at once for whom it is meant, because the character is so like him. While the author cannot but feel the full force of the compliment thus conveyed to him, he ventures to suggest that these contentions may arise from the fact that Mr. Squeers is the representative of a class and not of an individual, where imposture, ignorance, and brutal cupidity are the stock in trade of a small body of men, and one is described by these characteristics, all his fellows will recognize something belonging to themselves, and each will have a misgiving that the portrait is his own. The author's object in calling public attention to the system would be very imperfectly fulfilled if he did not state now, in his own person, emphatically and earnestly, that Mr. Squeers and his school are faint and feeble pictures of an existing reality, purposely subdued and kept down lest they should be deemed impossible. That there are upon record trials at law in which damages have been sought as a poor recompense for lasting agonies and disfigurements inflicted upon children by the treatment of the master in these places, involving such offensive and foul details of neglect, cruelty, and disease as no writer of fiction would have the boldness to imagine. and that, since he has been engaged upon these adventures, he has received, from private quarters far beyond the reach of suspicion or distrust, accounts of atrocities in the perpetration of which upon neglected or repudiated children these schools have been the main instruments, very far exceeding any that appear in these pages. This comprises all I need to say on the subject, except that if I had seen occasion, I had resolved to reprint a few of these details of legal proceedings from certain old newspapers. One other quotation from the same preface may serve to introduce a fact that my readers may think curious. To turn to a more pleasant subject, it may be right to say that there are two characters in this book which are drawn from life. It is remarkable that what we call the world, which is so very credulous in what professes to be true, is most incredulous in what professes to be imaginary, and that while every day in real life it will allow in one man no blemishes, and in another no virtues, it will seldom admit a very strongly marked character, either good or bad, in a fictitious narrative, to be within the limits of probability. But those who take an interest in this tale will be glad to learn that the brothers Cheeryble live, that their liberal charity, their singleness of heart, their noble nature, and their unbounded benevolence are no creations of the author's brain, but are prompting every day, and oftenest by stealth, some munificent and generous deed in that town of which they are the pride and honour. If I were to attempt to sum up the thousands of letters from all sorts of people in all sorts of latitudes and climates which this unlucky paragraph brought down upon me, I should get into an arithmetical difficulty from which I could not easily extricate myself. Suffice it to say that I believe the applications for loans, gifts, and offices of profit that I have been requested to forward to the originals of the brothers Cheeryble, with whom I never interchanged any communication in my life, would have exhausted the combined patronage of all the Lord Chancellors since the accession of the House of Brunswick, and would have broken the rest of the Bank of England. The brothers are now dead. There is only one other point on which I would desire to offer a remark. If Nicholas be not always found to be blameless or agreeable, he is not always intended to appear so. He is a young man of an impetuous temper and of little or no experience, and I saw no reason why such a hero should be lifted out of nature. End of author's preface. Of the life and adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 1 introduces all the rest. There once lived in a sequestered part of the county of Devonshire one Mr. Godfrey Nickleby, a worthy gentleman, who, taking it into his head rather late in life that he must get married, and not being young enough or rich enough to aspire to the hand of a lady of fortune, had wedded an old flame out of mere attachment, who in her turn had taken him for the same reason. Thus two people who cannot afford to play cards for money sometimes sit down to a quiet game for love. Some ill-conditioned persons who sneer at the life matrimonial may perhaps suggest, in this place, that the good couple would be better likened to two principals in a sparring match, who, when fortune is low and backers scarce, will chivalrously set to for the mere pleasure of the buffeting, and in one respect indeed this comparison would hold good. For, as the adventurous pair of the Fives Court will afterwards send round a hat and trust to the bounty of the lookers-on for the means of regaling themselves, so Mr. Godfrey Nickleby and his partner, the honeymoon being over, looked out wistfully into the world, relying in no inconsiderable degree upon chance for the improvement of their means. Mr. Nickleby's income at the period of his marriage fluctuated between £60 and £80 per annum. There are people enough in the world, heaven knows, and even in London, where Mr. Nickleby dwelt in those days, but few complaints prevail of the population being scanty. It is extraordinary how long a man may look among the crowd without discovering the face of a friend, but it is no less true. Mr. Nickleby looked and looked till his eyes became sore as his heart, but no friend appeared. And when, growing tired of the search, he turned his eyes homeward, he saw very little there to relieve his weary vision. A painter who has gazed too long upon some glaring colour refreshes his dazzled sight by looking upon a darker and more sombre tint, but everything that met Mr. Nickleby's gaze wore so black and gloomy a hue that he would have been beyond description refreshed by the very reverse of the contrast. At length, after 5 years, when Mrs. Nickleby had presented her husband with a couple of sons, and that embarrassed gentleman, impressed with the necessity of making some provision for his family, was seriously revolving in his mind a little commercial speculation of insuring his life next quarter-day and then falling from the top of the monument by accident, there came one morning by the general post a black-bordered letter to inform him how his uncle, Mr. Ralph Nickleby, was dead, and had left him the bulk of his little property, amounting in all to £5,000 sterling. As the deceased had taken no further notice of his nephew in his lifetime than sending to his eldest boy, who had been christened after him on desperate speculation, a silver spoon in a morocco case, which, as he had not too much to eat with it, seemed a kind of satire upon his having been born without that useful article of plate in his mouth. Mr. Godfrey Nickleby could, at first, scarcely believe the tidings thus conveyed to him. On examination, however, they turned out to be strictly correct. The amiable old gentleman, it seemed, had intended to leave the whole to the Royal Humane Society, and had indeed executed a will to that effect. But the institution, having been unfortunate enough, a few months before, to save the life of a poor relation to whom he paid a weekly allowance of 3 shillings and sixpence, he had, in a fit of very natural exasperation, revoked the bequest in a codicil and left it all to Mr. Godfrey Nickleby, with a special mention of his indignation not only against the society for saving the poor relation's life, but against the poor relation also for allowing himself to be saved. With a portion of this property, Mr. Godfrey Nickleby purchased a small farm near Dawlish in Devonshire, whither he retired with his wife and 2 children to live upon the best interest he could get for the rest of his money and the little produce he could raise from his land. The two prospered so well together that, when he died some 15 years after this period, and some 5 after his wife, he was enabled to leave to his eldest son Ralph £3,000 in cash, and to his youngest son Nicholas 1,000 and the farm, which was as small a landed estate as one would desire to see. These 2 brothers had been brought up together in a school at Exeter, and, being accustomed to go home once a week, had often heard from their mother's lips long accounts of their father's sufferings in his days of poverty, and of their deceased uncle's importance in his days of affluence, which recitals produced a very different impression on the 2. For, while the younger, who was of a timid and retiring disposition, gleaned from thence nothing but forewarnings to shun the great world and attach himself to the quiet routine of a country life, Ralph, the elder, deduced from the often repeated tale the 2 great morals that riches are the only true source of happiness and power, and that it is lawful and just to compass their acquisition by all means short of felony. And, reasoned Ralph with himself, if no good came of my uncle's money when he was alive, a great deal of good came of it after he was dead, inasmuch as my father has got it now and is saving it up for me, which is a highly virtuous purpose, and, going back to the old gentleman, good did come of it to him too, for he had the pleasure of thinking of it all his life long, and of being envied and courted by all his family besides. And Ralph always wound up these mental soliloquies by arriving at the conclusion that there was nothing like money. Not confining himself to theory, or permitting his faculties to rust, even at that early age, in mere abstract speculations, this promising lad commenced usurer on a limited scale at school, putting out at good interest a small capital of slate pencil and marbles, and gradually extending his operations until they aspired to the copper coinage of this realm, in which he speculated to considerable advantage. Nor did he trouble his borrowers with abstract calculations of figures or references to ready reckoners, his simple rule of interest being all comprised in the one golden sentence, "Twopence for every halfpenny," which greatly simplified the accounts, and which, as a familiar precept, more easily acquired and retained in the memory than any known rule of arithmetic, cannot be too strongly recommended to the notice of capitalists, both large and small, and more especially of money brokers and bill discounters. Indeed, to do these gentlemen justice, many of them are to this day in the frequent habit of adopting it with eminent success. In like manner did young Ralph Nickleby avoid all those minute and intricate calculations of odd days, which nobody who has worked sums in simple interest can fail to have found most embarrassing, by establishing the one general rule, that all sums of principal and interest should be paid on pocket-money day, that is to say, on Saturday, and that whether a loan were contracted on the Monday or on the Friday, the amount of interest should be in both cases the same. Indeed, he argued, and with great show of reason, that it ought to be rather more for one day than for 5, inasmuch as the borrower might in the former case be very fairly presumed to be in great extremity, otherwise he would not borrow at all with such odds against him. This fact is interesting, as illustrating the secret connection and sympathy which always exist between great minds. Though Master Ralph Nickleby was not at that time aware of it, the class of gentlemen before alluded to proceed on just the same principle in all their transactions. From what we have said of this young gentleman, and the natural admiration the reader will immediately conceive of his character, it may perhaps be inferred that he is to be the hero of the work which we shall presently begin. To set this point at rest, for once and for ever, we hasten to undeceive them and stride to its commencement. On the death of his father, Ralph Nickleby, who had been some time before placed in a mercantile house in London, applied himself passionately to his old pursuit of money-getting, in which he speedily became so buried and absorbed that he quite forgot his brother for many years. And if at times a recollection of his old playfellow broke upon him through the haze in which he lived, for gold conjures up a mist about a man more destructive of all his old senses and lulling to his feelings than the fumes of charcoal, it brought along with it a companion thought, that if they were intimate he would want to borrow money of him. So Mr. Ralph Nickleby shrugged his shoulders and said things were better as they were. As for Nicholas, he lived a single man on the patrimonial estate until he grew tired of living alone, and then he took to wife the daughter of a neighbouring gentleman with a dower of £1,000. This good lady bore him 2 children, a son and a daughter, and when the son was about 19 and the daughter 14, as near as we can guess, impartial records of young ladies' ages being, before the passing of the new Act, nowhere preserved in the registries of this country, Mr. Nickleby looked about him for the means of repairing his capital, now sadly reduced by this increase in his family and the expenses of their education. "Speculate with it," said Mrs. Nickleby. "Speculate, my dear?" said Mr. Nickleby, as though in doubt. "Why not?" asked Mrs. Nickleby. "Because, my dear, if we should lose it," rejoined Mr. Nickleby, who was a slow and time-taking speaker, "if we should lose it, we shall no longer be able to live, my dear." "Fiddle!" said Mrs. Nickleby. "I am not altogether sure of that, my dear," said Mr. Nickleby. "There's Nicholas," pursued the lady, "quite a young man. It's time he was in the way of doing something for himself. And Kate too, poor girl, without a penny in the world. Think of your brother. Would he be what he is if he hadn't speculated?" "That's true," replied Mr. Nickleby. "Very good, my dear. Yes, I will speculate, my dear." Speculation is a round game. The players see little or nothing of their cards at first starting. Gains may be great, and so may losses. The run of luck went against Mr. Nickleby. A mania prevailed, a bubble burst, 4 stockbrokers took villa residences at Florence, 400 nobodies were ruined, and among them Mr. Nickleby. "The very house I live in," sighed the poor gentleman, "may be taken from me to-morrow. Not an article of my old furniture, but will be sold to strangers." The last reflection hurt him so much that he took at once to his bed, apparently resolved to keep that at all events. "Cheer up, sir," said the apothecary.
"You mustn't let yourself be cast down, sir,"
said the nurse. "Such things happen every day," remarked the lawyer, "and it is very sinful to rebel against them," whispered the clergyman. "And what no man with a family ought to do," added the neighbours. Mr. Nickleby shook his head, and motioning them all out of the room, embraced his wife and children, and having pressed them by turns to his languidly beating heart, sunk exhausted on his pillow. They were concerned to find that his reason went astray after this, for he babbled for a long time about the generosity and goodness of his brother and the merry old times when they were at school together. This fit of wandering past, he solemnly commended them to One who never deserted the widow or her fatherless children, and, smiling gently on them, turned upon his face and observed that he thought he could fall asleep. End of chapter 1. Of the Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 2. Of Mr. Ralph Nickleby and his establishments and his undertakings, and of a great joint stock company of vast national importance. Mr. Ralph Nickleby was not, strictly speaking, what you would call a merchant. Neither was he a banker, nor an attorney, nor a special pleader, nor a notary. He was certainly not a tradesman, and still less could he lay any claim to the title of a professional gentleman, for it would have been impossible to mention any recognized profession to which he belonged. Nevertheless, as he lived in a spacious house in Golden Square, which, in addition to a brass plate upon the street door, had another brass plate 2 sizes and a half smaller upon the left-hand door-post, surrounding a brass model of an infant's fist grasping a fragment of a skewer and displaying the word "Office," it was clear that Mr. Ralph Nickleby did, or pretended to do, business of some kind. And the fact, if it required any further circumstantial evidence, was abundantly demonstrated by the diurnal attendance, between the hours of 9:30 and 5, of a sallow-faced man in rusty brown, who sat upon an uncommonly hard stool in a species of butler's pantry at the end of the passage, and always had a pen behind his ear when he answered the bell. Although a few members of the graver professions live about Golden Square, it is not exactly in anybody's way to or from anywhere. It is one of the squares that have been a quarter of the town that has gone down in the world and taken to letting lodgings. Many of its first and second floors are let, furnished, to single gentlemen, and it takes boarders besides. It is a great resort of foreigners. The dark-complexioned men who wear large rings and heavy watch-guards and bushy whiskers, and who congregate under the opera colonnade, and about the box-office in the season, between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, when they give away the orders, all live in Golden Square or within a street of it. 2 or 3 violins and a wind instrument from the opera band reside within its precincts. Its boarding-houses are musical, and the notes of pianos and harps float in the evening-time round the head of the mournful statue, the guardian genius of a little wilderness of shrubs in the centre of the square. On a summer's night, windows are thrown open, and groups of swarthy moustached men are seen by the passer-by, lounging at the casements and smoking fearfully. Sounds of gruff voices practising vocal music invade the evening silence, and the fumes of choice tobacco scent the air. There snuff and cigars, and German pipes and flutes, and violins and violoncellos divide the supremacy between them. It is the region of song and smoke. Street bands are on their metal in Golden Square, and itinerant glee singers quaver involuntarily as they raise their voices within its boundaries. This would not seem a spot very well adapted to the transaction of business, but Mr. Ralph Nickleby had lived there notwithstanding for many years, and uttered no complaint on that score. He knew nobody round about, and nobody knew him, although he enjoyed the reputation of being immensely rich. The tradesmen held that he was a sort of lawyer, and the other neighbours opined that he was a kind of general agent, both of which guesses were as correct and definite as guesses about other people's affairs usually are, or need to be. Mr. Ralph Nickleby sat in his private office one morning, ready dressed to walk abroad. He wore a bottle-green spencer over a blue coat, a white waistcoat, grey mixture pantaloons, and Wellington boots drawn over them. The corner of a small plaited shirt-frill struggled out, as if insisting to show itself, from between his chin and the top button of his spencer, and the latter garment was not made low enough to conceal a long gold watch-chain, composed of a series of plain rings which had its beginning at the handle of a gold repeater in Mr. Nickleby's pocket, and its termination in two little keys, one belonging to the watch itself and the other to some patent padlock. He wore a sprinkling of powder upon his head, as if to make himself look benevolent, but if that were his purpose, he would perhaps have done better to powder his countenance also, for there was something in its very wrinkles, and in his cold restless eye, which seemed to tell of cunning that would announce itself in spite of him. However this might be, there he was, and as he was all alone, neither the powder, nor the wrinkles, nor the eyes had the smallest effect, good or bad, upon anybody just then, and are consequently no business of ours just now. Mr. Nickleby closed an account-book which lay on his desk, and throwing himself back in his chair, gazed with an air of abstraction through the dirty window. Some London houses have a melancholy little plot of ground behind them, usually fenced in by 4 high whitewashed walls and frowned upon by stacks of chimneys, in which there withers on, from year to year, a crippled tree that makes a show of putting forth a few leaves late in autumn when other trees shed theirs, and, drooping in the effort, lingers on, all crackled and smoke-dried, till the following season, when it repeats the same process, and perhaps, if the weather be particularly genial, even tempts some rheumatic sparrow to chirrup in its branches. People sometimes call these dark yards gardens. It is not supposed that they were ever planted, but rather that they are pieces of unreclaimed land, with the withered vegetation of the original brick field. No man thinks of walking in this desolate place, or of turning it to any account. A few hampers, 6 broken bottles, and such like rubbish may be thrown there when the tenant first moves in, but nothing more, and there they remain until he goes away again, the damp straw taking just as long to moulder as it thinks proper, and mingling with the scanty box and stunted ever-browns and broken flower-pots that are scattered mournfully about, a prey to blacks and dirt. It was into a place of this kind that Mr. Ralph Nickleby gazed as he sat with his hands in his pockets looking out of the window. He had fixed his eyes upon a distorted fir-tree, planted by some former tenant in a tub that had once been green and left there years before to rot away piecemeal. There was nothing very inviting in the object, but Mr. Nickleby was wrapped in a brown study, and sat contemplating it with far greater attention than, in a more conscious mood, he would have deigned to bestow upon the rarest exotic. At length his eyes wandered to a little dirty window on the left, through which the face of the clerk was dimly visible. That worthy chancing to look up, he beckoned him to attend. In obedience to this summons, the clerk got off the high stool, to which he had communicated a high polish by countless gettings off and on, and presented himself in Mr. Nickleby's room. He was a tall man of middle age, with 2 goggle eyes, whereof one was a fixture, a rubicund nose, a cadaverous face, and a suit of clothes, if the term be allowable when they suited him not at all, much the worse for wear, very much too small, and placed upon such a short allowance of buttons that it was marvellous how he contrived to keep them on. "Was that 12:30, Noggs?" said Mr. Nickleby in a sharp and grating voice. "Not more than 25 by the—" Noggs was going to add public-house clock, but recollecting himself, substituted "regular time." "My watch has stopped," said Mr. Nickleby. "I don't know from what cause." "Not wound up?" said Noggs. "Yes, it is," said Mr. Nickleby. "Overwound, then," rejoined Noggs. "That can't very well be," observed Mr. Nickleby. "Must be," said Noggs. "Well," said Mr. Nickleby, putting the repeater back in his pocket, "perhaps it is." Noggs gave a peculiar grunt, as was his custom at the end of all disputes with his master, to imply that he, Noggs, triumphed, and as he rarely spoke to anybody unless somebody spoke to him, fell into a grim silence, and rubbed his hands slowly over each other, cracking the joints of his fingers and squeezing them into all possible distortions. The incessant performance of this routine on every occasion, and the communication of a fixed and rigid look to his unaffected eye, so as to make it uniform with the other, and to render it impossible for anybody to determine where or at what he was looking, were two among the numerous peculiarities of Mr. Noggs, which struck an inexperienced observer at first sight. "I am going to the London Tavern this morning," said Mr. Nickleby. "Public meeting?" inquired Noggs. Mr. Nickleby nodded. "I expect a letter from the solicitor respecting that mortgage of Ruddles. If it comes at all, it will be here by the 2 o'clock delivery. I shall leave the city about that time and walk to Charing Cross, on the left-hand side of the way. If there are any letters, come and meet me, and bring them with you." Noggs nodded, and as he nodded there came a ring at the office bell. The master looked up from his papers, and the clerk calmly remained in a stationary position. "The bell," said Noggs, as though in explanation. "At home?" "Yes." "To anybody?" "Yes." "To the tax-gatherer?" "No." "Let him call again." Noggs gave vent to his usual grunt, as much as to say, "I thought so," and, the ring being repeated, went to the door, whence he presently returned, ushering in, by the name of Mr. Bonney, a pale gentleman in a violent hurry, who, with his hair standing up in great disorder all over his head and a very narrow white cravat tied loosely round his throat, looked as if he had been knocked up in the night and had not dressed himself since. "My dear Nickleby," said the gentleman, taking off a white hat, which was so full of papers that it would scarcely stick upon his head, "there's not a moment to lose. I have a cab at the door. Sir Matthew Pupker takes the chair, and 3 members of Parliament are positively coming. I have seen 2 of them safely out of bed. The third, who was at Crockford's all night, has just gone home to put a clean shirt on and take a bottle or 2 of soda water, and will certainly be with us in time to address the meeting. He is a little excited by last night, but never mind that. He always speaks the stronger for it." "It seems to promise pretty well," said Mr. Ralph Nickleby, whose deliberate manner was strongly opposed to the vivacity of the other man of business. "Pretty well," echoed Mr. Bonney. "It's the finest idea that was ever started. United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. Capital, 5 millions, in 500,000 shares of £10 each. Why, the very name will get the shares up to a premium in 10 days." "And when they are at a premium," said Mr. Ralph Nickleby, smiling, "when they are, you know what to do with them, as well as any man alive, and how to back quietly out at the right time," said Mr. Bonney, slapping the capitalist familiarly on the shoulder. "By the by, what a very remarkable man that clerk of yours is." "Yes, poor devil," replied Ralph, drawing on his gloves, "though Newman Noggs kept his horses and hounds once." "Aye, aye," said the other carelessly. "Yes," continued Ralph, "and not many years ago either. But he squandered his money, invested it anyhow, borrowed at interest, and, in short, made first a thorough fool of himself and then a beggar. He took to drinking, and had a touch of paralysis, and then came here to borrow £1, as in his better days I had—" "Done business with him?" said Mr. Bonney with a meaning look. "Just so," replied Ralph. "I couldn't lend it, you know." "Of course not." "But as I wanted a clerk just then to open the door and so forth, I took him out of charity, and he has remained with me ever since. He is a little mad, I think," said Mr. Nickleby, calling up a charitable look, "but he is useful enough, poor creature, useful enough." The kind-hearted gentleman omitted to add that Newman Noggs, being utterly destitute, served him for rather less than the usual wages of a boy of 13, and likewise failed to mention in his hasty chronicle that his eccentric taciturnity rendered him an especially valuable person in a place where much business was done, of which it was desirable no mention should be made out of doors. The other gentleman was plainly impatient to be gone, however, and as they hurried into the hackney cabriolet, immediately afterwards, perhaps Mr. Nickleby forgot to mention circumstances so unimportant. There was a great bustle in Bishopsgate Street within as they drew up, and, it being a windy day, 6 men were tacking across the road under a press of paper bearing gigantic announcements that a public meeting would be holden at 1 o'clock precisely, to take into consideration the propriety of petitioning Parliament in favour of the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. Capital 5 millions in 500,000 shares of £10 each, which sums were duly set forth in fat black figures of considerable size. Mr. Bonney elbowed his way briskly upstairs, receiving in his progress many low bows from the waiters who stood on the landings to show the way, and followed by Mr. Nickleby, dived into a suite of apartments behind the great public room, in the second of which was a business-looking table and several business-looking people. "Here!" cried a gentleman with a double chin as Mr. Bonney presented himself. "Chair, gentlemen, chair!" The newcomers were received with universal approbation, and Mr. Bonney bustled up to the top of the table, took off his hat, ran his fingers through his hair, and knocked a hackney coachman's knock on the table with a little hammer, whereat several gentlemen cried "Here!" and nodded slightly to each other, as much as to say what spirited conduct that was. Just at this moment a waiter, feverish with agitation, tore into the room, and throwing the door open with a crash, shouted, "Sir Matthew Pupker!" The committee stood up and clapped their hands for joy, and while they were clapping them, in came Sir Matthew Pupker, attended by 2 live members of Parliament, one Irish and one Scotch, all smiling and bowing and looking so pleasant that it seemed a perfect marvel how any man could have the heart to vote against them. Sir Matthew Pupker especially, who had a little round head with a flaxen wig on the top of it, fell into such a paroxysm of bows that the wig threatened to be jerked off every instant. When these symptoms had in some degree subsided, the gentlemen who were on speaking terms with Sir Matthew Pupker or the 2 other members crowded round them in 3 little groups, near one or other of which the gentlemen who were not on speaking terms with Sir Matthew Pupker or the 2 other members stood lingering and smiling and rubbing their hands in the desperate hope of something turning up which might bring them into notice. All this time Sir Matthew Pupker and the 2 other members were relating to their separate circles what the intentions of government were about taking up the bill, with a full account of what the government had said in a whisper the last time they dined with it, and how the government had been observed to wink when it said so, from which premises they were at no loss to draw the conclusion that if the government had one object more at heart than another, that one object was the welfare and advantage of the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. Meanwhile, and pending the arrangement of the proceedings and a fair division of the speechifying, the public in the large room were eyeing, by turns, the empty platform and the ladies in the music gallery. In these amusements the greater portion of them had been occupied for a couple of hours before, and as the most agreeable diversions pall upon the taste on a too protracted enjoyment of them, the sterner spirits now began to hammer the floor with their boot heels and to express their dissatisfaction by various hoots and cries. These vocal exertions, emanating from the people who had been there longest, naturally proceeded from those who were nearest to the platform and furthest from the policemen in attendance, who, having no great mind to fight their way through the crowd, but entertaining nevertheless a praiseworthy desire to do something to quell the disturbance, immediately began to drag forth by the coat-tails and collars all the quiet people near the door, at the same time dealing out various smart and tingling blows with their truncheons, after the manner of that ingenious actor Mr. Punch, whose brilliant example, both in the fashion of his weapons and their use, this branch of the executive occasionally follows. Several very exciting skirmishes were in progress when a loud shout attracted the attention even of the belligerents, and then there poured on to the platform, from a door at the side, a long line of gentlemen with their hats off, all looking behind them and uttering vociferous cheers, the cause whereof was sufficiently explained when Sir Matthew Pupker and the two other real members of Parliament came to the front amidst deafening shouts and testified to each other in dumb motions that they had never seen such a glorious sight as that in the whole course of their public career. At length and at last the assembly left off shouting, but Sir Matthew Pupker being voted into the chair, they underwent a relapse, which lasted 5 minutes. This over, Sir Matthew Pupker went on to say what must be his feelings on that great occasion, and what must be that occasion in the eyes of the world, and what must be the intelligence of his fellow countrymen before him, and what must be the wealth and respectability of his honourable friends behind him, and lastly, what must be the importance to the wealth, the happiness, the comfort, the liberty, the very existence of a free and great people, of such an institution as the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. Mr. Bonney then presented himself to move the first resolution, and having run his right hand through his hair and planted his left in an easy manner in his ribs, he consigned his hat to the care of the gentleman with the double chin, who acted as a species of bottle-holder to the orators generally, and said he would read to them the first resolution. That this meeting views with alarm and apprehension the existing state of the muffin trade in this metropolis and its neighbourhood, that it considers the muffin boys, as at present constituted, wholly undeserving the confidence of the public, and that it deems the whole muffin system alike prejudicial to the health and morals of the people and subversive of the best interests of a great commercial and mercantile community. The honourable gentleman made a speech which drew tears from the eyes of the ladies and awakened the liveliest emotions in every individual present. He had visited the houses of the poor in the various districts of London and had found them destitute of the slightest vestige of a muffin, which there appeared too much reason to believe some of these indigent persons did not taste from year's end to year's end. He had found that among muffin sellers there existed drunkenness, debauchery, and profligacy, which he attributed to the debasing nature of their employment as at present exercised. He had found the same vices among the poorer class of people who ought to be muffin consumers, and this he attributed to the despair engendered by their being placed beyond the reach of that nutritious article, which drove them to seek a false stimulant in intoxicating liquors. He would undertake to prove before a committee of the House of Commons that there existed a combination to keep up the price of muffins and to give the bellmen a monopoly. He would prove it by bellmen at the bar of that house, and he would also prove that these men corresponded with each other by secret words and signs as Snooks, Walker, Ferguson, Is Murphy right, and many others. It was this melancholy state of things that the company proposed to correct, firstly, by prohibiting, under heavy penalties, all private muffin trading of every description; secondly, by themselves supplying the public generally, and the poor at their own homes, with muffins of first quality at reduced prices. It was with this object that a bill had been introduced into Parliament by their patriotic chairman, Sir Matthew Pupker. It was this bill that they had met to support. It was the supporters of this bill who would confer undying brightness and splendour upon England under the name of the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. He would add, with a capital of 5 millions in 500,000 shares of £10 each. Mr. Ralph Nickleby seconded the resolution, and another gentleman having moved that it be amended by the insertion of the words "and crumpet," after the word muffin whenever it occurred, it was carried triumphantly. Only one man in the crowd cried no, and he was promptly taken into custody and straightway borne off. The second resolution, which recognized the expediency of immediately abolishing all muffin or crumpet sellers, all traders in muffins or crumpets, of whatsoever description, whether male or female, boys or men, ringing handbells or otherwise, was moved by a grievous gentleman of semi-clerical appearance, who went at once into such deep pathetics that he knocked the first speaker clean out of the course in no time. You might have heard a pin fall. A pin? A feather, as he described the cruelties inflicted on muffin boys by their masters, which he very wisely urged were in themselves a sufficient reason for the establishment of that inestimable company. It seemed that the unhappy youths were nightly turned out into the wet streets at the most inclement periods of the year, to wander about, in darkness and rain, or it might be hail or snow, for hours together, without shelter, food, or warmth. And let the public never forget upon the latter point that while the muffins were provided with warm clothing and blankets, the boys were wholly unprovided for and left to their own miserable resources. Shame! The honourable gentleman related one case of a muffin boy who, having been exposed to this inhuman and barbarous system for no less than 5 years, at length fell a victim to a cold in the head, beneath which he gradually sunk until he fell into a perspiration and recovered. This he could vouch for, on his own authority, but he had heard, and he had no reason to doubt the fact, of a still more heartrending and appalling circumstance. He had heard of the case of an orphan muffin boy, who, having been run over by a hackney carriage, had been removed to the hospital, had undergone the amputation of his leg below the knee, and was now actually pursuing his occupation on crutches. Fountain of justice, were these things to last? This was the department of the subject that took the meeting, and this was the style of speaking to enlist their sympathies. The men shouted, the ladies wept into their pocket-handkerchiefs till they were moist, and waved them till they were dry. The excitement was tremendous, and Mr. Nickleby whispered his friend that the shares were thenceforth at a premium of 25%. The resolution was, of course, carried with loud acclamations, every man holding up both hands in favour of it, as he would in his enthusiasm have held up both legs also, if he could have conveniently accomplished it. This done, the draft of the proposed petition was read at length, and the petition said, as all petitions do say, that the petitioners were very humble, and the petitioned very honourable, and the object very virtuous. Therefore, said the petition, the bill ought to be passed into a law at once, to the everlasting honour and glory of that most honourable and glorious Commons of England in Parliament assembled. Then the gentleman who had been at Crockford's all night, and who looked something the worse about the eyes in consequence, came forward to tell his fellow countrymen what a speech he meant to make in favour of that petition whenever it should be presented, and how desperately he meant to taunt the Parliament if they rejected the bill, and to inform them also that he regretted his honourable friends had not inserted a clause rendering the purchase of muffins and crumpets compulsory upon all classes of the community, which he, opposing all half-measures and preferring to go the extreme animal, pledged himself to propose and divide upon in committee. After announcing this determination, the honourable gentleman grew jocular, and as patent boots, lemon-coloured kid gloves, and a fur coat collar assist jokes materially, there was immense laughter, and much cheering, and moreover such a brilliant display of ladies' pocket-handkerchiefs as threw the grievous gentleman quite into the shade. And when the petition had been read and was about to be adopted, there came forth the Irish member, who was a young gentleman of ardent temperament, with such a speech as only an Irish member can make, breathing the true soul and spirit of poetry, and poured forth with such fervour that it made one warm to look at him. In the course whereof he told them how he would demand the extension of that great boon to his native country, how he would claim for her equal rights in the muffin laws as in all other laws, and how he hoped to see the day when crumpets should be toasted in her lowly cabins and muffin bells should ring in her rich green valleys. And after him came the Scotch member, with various pleasant allusions to the probable amount of profits which increased the good humour that the poetry had awakened, and all the speeches put together did exactly what they were intended to do, and established in the hearers' minds that there was no speculation so promising or at the same time so praiseworthy as the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. So the petition in favour of the bill was agreed upon, and the meeting adjourned with acclamations, and Mr. Nickleby and the other directors went to the office to lunch, as they did every day at 1:30, and to remunerate themselves for which trouble, as the company was yet in its infancy, they only charged 3 guineas each man for every such attendance. End of chapter 2. Of the Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 3. Mr. Ralph Nickleby receives sad tidings of his brother, but bears up nobly against the intelligence communicated to him. The reader is informed how he liked Nicholas, who is herein introduced, and how kindly he proposed to make his fortune at once. Having rendered his zealous assistance towards dispatching the lunch with all that promptitude and energy which are among the most important qualities that men of business can possess, Mr. Ralph Nickleby took a cordial farewell of his fellow speculators and bent his steps westward in unwonted good humour. As he passed St. Paul's, he stepped aside into a doorway to set his watch, and with his hand on the key and his eye on the cathedral dial, was intent upon so doing when a man suddenly stopped before him. It was Newman Noggs. "Ah, Newman," said Mr. Nickleby, looking up as he pursued his occupation. "The letter about the mortgage has come, has it? I thought it would." "Wrong," replied Newman. "What? And nobody called respecting it?" inquired Mr. Nickleby, pausing. Noggs shook his head. "What has come, then?" inquired Mr. Nickleby. "I have," said Newman. "What else?" demanded the master sternly. "This," said Newman, drawing a sealed letter slowly from his pocket. "Postmark, Strand, black wax, black border, woman's hand, C.N. in the corner." "Black wax," said Mr. Nickleby, glancing at the letter. "I know something of that hand too, Newman. I shouldn't be surprised if my brother were dead." "I don't think you would," said Newman quietly. "Why not, sir?" demanded Mr. Nickleby. "You never are surprised," replied Newman. "That's all." Mr. Nickleby snatched the letter from his assistant, and fixing a cold look upon him, opened, read it, put it in his pocket, and having now hit the time to a second, began winding up his watch. "It is as I expected, Newman," said Mr. Nickleby, while he was thus engaged. "He is dead. Dear me. Well, that's a sudden thing. I shouldn't have thought it, really." With these touching expressions of sorrow, Mr. Nickleby replaced his watch in his fob, and, fitting on his gloves to a nicety, turned upon his way and walked slowly westward with his hands behind him. "Children alive?" inquired Noggs, stepping up to him. "Why, that's the very thing," replied Mr. Nickleby, as though his thoughts were about them at the moment. "They are both alive." "Both?" repeated Newman Noggs in a low voice. "And the widow too," added Mr. Nickleby. "And all 3 in London, confound them, all 3 here, Newman." Newman fell a little behind his master, and his face was curiously twisted as by a spasm. But whether of paralysis, or grief, or inward laughter, nobody but himself could possibly explain. The expression of a man's face is commonly a help to his thoughts, or glossary on his speech, but the countenance of Newman Noggs, in his ordinary moods, was a problem which no stretch of ingenuity could solve. "Go home," said Mr. Nickleby, after he had walked a few paces, looking round at the clerk as if he were his dog. The words were scarcely uttered when Newman darted across the road, slunk among the crowd, and disappeared in an instant. "Reasonable, certainly," muttered Mr. Nickleby to himself as he walked on. "Very reasonable. My brother never did anything for me, and I never expected it. The breath is no sooner out of his body than I am to be looked to as the support of a great hearty woman and a grown boy and girl. What are they to me? I never saw them." Full of these and many other reflections of a similar kind, Mr. Nickleby made the best of his way to the Strand, and, referring to his letter as if to ascertain the number of the house he wanted, stopped at a private door about half-way down that crowded thoroughfare. A miniature painter lived there, for there was a large gilt frame screwed upon the street door, in which were displayed, upon a black velvet ground, two portraits of naval dress-coats with faces looking out of them, and telescopes attached. One of a young gentleman in a very vermilion uniform, flourishing a sabre, and one of a literary character with a high forehead, a pen and ink, 6 books, and a curtain. There was, moreover, a touching representation of a young lady reading a manuscript in an unfathomable forest, and a charming whole length of a large-headed little boy sitting on a stool with his legs foreshortened to the size of salt-spoons. Besides these works of art, there were a great many heads of old ladies and gentlemen smirking at each other out of blue and brown skies, and an elegantly written card of terms with an embossed border. Mr. Nickleby glanced at these frivolities with great contempt and gave a double knock, which, having been thrice repeated, was answered by a servant-girl with an uncommonly dirty face. "Is Mrs. Nickleby at home, girl?" demanded Ralph sharply.
"Her name ain't Nickleby," said the girl. "Nickleby, you mean." Mr. Nickleby looked very indignant at the handmaid on being thus corrected, and demanded with much asperity what she meant, which she was about to state when a female voice proceeding from a perpendicular staircase at the end of the passage inquired who was wanted. "Mrs. Nickleby," said Ralph. "It's the second floor, Hannah," said the same voice. "What a stupid thing you are! Is the second floor at home?" "Somebody went out just now, but I think it was the attic which had been a-cleaning of himself," replied the girl. "You had better see," said the invisible female. "Show the gentleman where the bell is, and tell him he mustn't knock double knocks for the second floor. I can't allow a knock, except when the bell's broke, and then it must be 2 single ones."
"Here," said Ralph, walking in without more parley. "I beg your pardon. Is that Mrs. what's her name?"
"Creevy. La Creevy," replied the voice, as a yellow headdress bobbed over the banisters. "I'll speak to you a moment, ma'am, with your leave," said Ralph. The voice replied that the gentleman was to walk up, but he had walked up before it spoke, and stepping into the first floor was received by the wearer of the yellow headdress, who had a gown to correspond and was of much the same colour herself. Miss La Creevy was a mincing young lady of 50, and Miss La Creevy's apartment was the gilt frame downstairs on a larger scale and something dirtier. "Ahem,"
said Miss La Creevy, coughing delicately behind her black silk mitten.
A miniature, I presume. A very strongly marked countenance for the purpose, sir. Have you ever sat before?"
"You mistake my purpose, I see, ma'am," replied Mr. Nickleby in his usual blunt fashion. "I have no money to throw away on miniatures, ma'am, and nobody to give one to, thank God, if I had. Seeing you on the stairs, I wanted to ask a question of you about some lodgers here." Miss La Creevy coughed once more. This cough was to conceal her disappointment, and said,
"Oh, indeed."
"I infer from what you said to your servant that the floor above belongs to you, ma'am?" said Mr. Nickleby. Yes, it did, Miss La Creevy replied. The upper part of the house belonged to her, and as she had no necessity for the second-floor rooms just then, she was in the habit of letting them, Indeed, there was a lady from the country and her 2 children in them at the present speaking. "A widow, ma'am?" said Ralph.
"Yes, she is a widow,"
replied the lady. "A poor widow, ma'am?" said Ralph, with a powerful emphasis on that little adjective which conveys so much.
"Well, I'm afraid she is poor," rejoined Miss La Creevy.
"I happen to know that she is, ma'am," said Ralph. "Now, what business has a poor widow in such a house as this, ma'am?"
"Very true,"
replied Miss La Creevy, not at all displeased with this implied compliment to the apartments.
"Exceedingly true."
"I know her circumstances intimately, ma'am," said Ralph. "In fact, I am a relation of the family, and I should recommend you not to keep them here, ma'am."
"I should hope, if there was any compatibility to meet the pecuniary obligations," said Miss La Creevy with another cough, "that the lady's family would—"
"No, they wouldn't, ma'am," interrupted Ralph hastily. "Don't think it."
"If I am to understand that," said Miss La Creevy, "the case wears a very different appearance."
"You may understand it then, ma'am," said Ralph, "and make your arrangements accordingly. I am the family, ma'am. At least, I believe I am the only relation they have, and I think it right that you should know I can't support them in their extravagances. How long have they taken these lodgings for?"
"Only from week to week," replied Miss La Creevy. "Mrs. Nickleby paid the first week in advance."
"Then you had better get them out at the end of it," said Ralph. "They can't do better than go back to the country, ma'am. They are in everybody's way here."
"Certainly," said Miss La Creevy, rubbing her hands. "If Mrs. Nickleby took the apartments without the means of paying for them, it was very unbecoming a lady."
"Of course it was, ma'am," said Ralph.
"And naturally," continued Miss La Creevy, "I, who am at present an unprotected female, cannot afford to lose by the apartments."
"Of course you can't, ma'am," replied Ralph.
"Though, at the same time," added Miss La Creevy, who was plainly wavering between her good nature and her interest, "I have nothing whatever to say against the lady, who is extremely pleasant and affable, though, poor thing, she seems terribly low in her spirits, nor against the young people either, for nicer or better behaved young people cannot be."
"Very well, ma'am," said Ralph, turning to the door, for these encomiums on poverty irritated him. "I have done my duty, and perhaps more than I ought. Of course, nobody will thank me for saying what I have."
"I am sure I am very much obliged to you, at least, sir," said Miss La Creevy in a gracious manner. "Would you do me the favour to look at a few specimens of my portrait painting?"
"You're very good, ma'am," said Mr. Nickleby, making off with great speed. "But as I have a visit to pay upstairs and my time is precious, I really can't."
"At any other time, when you are passing, I shall be most happy," said Miss La Creevy. "Perhaps you will have the kindness to take a card of terms with you. Thank you. Good morning."
"Good morning, ma'am," said Ralph, shutting the door abruptly after him to prevent any further conversation. "Now for my sister-in-law. Bah!" Climbing up another perpendicular flight, composed with great mechanical ingenuity of nothing but corner stairs, Mr. Ralph Nickleby stopped to take breath on the landing, when he was overtaken by the handmaid whom the politeness of Miss La Creevy had dispatched to announce him, and who had apparently been making a variety of unsuccessful attempts since their last interview to wipe her dirty face clean upon an apron much dirtier.
"What name?"
said the girl. "Nickleby," replied Ralph.
"Oh, Mrs. Nickleby," said the girl, throwing open the door. "Here's Mr. Nickleby."
A lady in deep mourning rose as Mr. Ralph Nickleby entered, but appeared incapable of advancing to meet him, and leant upon the arm of a slight but very beautiful girl of about 17, who had been sitting by her. A youth who appeared a year or two older stepped forward and saluted Ralph as his uncle. "Oh!" growled Ralph, with an ill-favoured frown. "You are Nicholas, I suppose?" "That is my name, sir," replied the youth. "Put my hat down," said Ralph imperiously. "Well, ma'am, how do you do? You must bear up against sorrow, ma'am. I always do."
"Mine was no common loss,"
said Mrs. Nickleby, applying her handkerchief to her eyes. "It was no uncommon loss, ma'am," returned Ralph as he coolly unbuttoned his spencer. "Husbands die every day, ma'am, and wives too."
"And brothers also, sir," said Nicholas with a glance of indignation.
"Yes, sir, and puppies and pug-dogs likewise," replied his uncle, taking a chair. "You didn't mention in your letter what my brother's complaint was, ma'am."
"The doctors could attribute it to no particular disease," said Mrs. Nickleby, shedding tears. "We have too much reason to fear that he died of a broken heart."
"Pooh!" said Ralph. "There's no such thing. I can understand a man's dying of a broken neck, or suffering from a broken arm, or a broken head, or a broken leg, or a broken nose. But a broken heart? Nonsense! It's the cant of the day. If a man can't pay his debts, he dies of a broken heart, and his widow's a martyr."
"Some people, I believe, have no hearts to break," observed Nicholas quietly.
"How old is this boy, for God's sake?" inquired Ralph, wheeling back his chair and surveying his nephew from head to foot with intense scorn.
"Nicholas is very nearly 19,"
replied the widow. 19, eh?" said Ralph. "And what do you mean to do for your bread, sir?"
"Not to live upon my mother," replied Nicholas, his heart swelling as he spoke.
"You'd have little enough to live upon if you did," retorted the uncle, eyeing him contemptuously. "Whatever it be," said Nicholas, flushed with anger, "I shall not look to you to make it more."
"Nicholas, my dear, recollect yourself," remonstrated Mrs. Nickleby. "Dear Nicholas, pray," urged the young lady.
"Hold your tongue, sir," said Ralph. "Upon my word, fine beginnings, Mrs. Nickleby, fine beginnings."
Mrs. Nickleby made no other reply than entreating Nicholas by a gesture to keep silent, and the uncle and nephew looked at each other for some seconds without speaking. The face of the old man was stern, hard-featured, and forbidding; that of the young one, open, handsome, and ingenuous. The old man's eye was keen with the twinkling of avarice and cunning, the young man's bright with the light of intelligence and spirit. His figure was somewhat slight, but manly and well formed, and, apart from all the grace of youth and comeliness, there was an emanation from the warm young heart in his look and bearing which kept the old man down. However striking such a contrast as this may be to lookers on, none ever felt it with half the keenness or acuteness of perfection with which it strikes to the very soul of him whose inferiority it marks. It galled Ralph to the heart's core, and he hated Nicholas from that hour. The mutual inspection was at length brought to a close by Ralph withdrawing his eyes with a great show of disdain and calling Nicholas a boy. This word is much used as a term of reproach by elderly gentlemen towards their juniors, probably with the view of deluding society into the belief that if they could be young again they wouldn't on any account. "Well, ma'am," said Ralph impatiently, "the creditors have administered, you tell me, and there's nothing left for you?" "Nothing,"
replied Mrs. Nickleby. "And you spent what little money you had in coming all the way to London to see what I could do for you?" pursued Ralph.
I hoped," faltered Mrs. Nickleby, "that you might have an opportunity of doing something for your brother's children. It was his dying wish that I should appeal to you in their behalf."
"I don't know how it is," muttered Ralph, walking up and down the room, "but whenever a man dies without any property of his own, he always seems to think he has a right to dispose of other people's. What is your daughter fit for, ma'am?"
"Kate has been well educated," sobbed Mrs. Nickleby. "Tell your uncle, my dear, how far you went in French and extras."
The poor girl was about to murmur something when her uncle stopped her very unceremoniously. "We must try and get you apprenticed at some boarding school," said Ralph. "You have not been brought up too delicately for that, I hope?"
"Oh, no, indeed, uncle," replied the weeping girl. I will try to do anything that will gain me a home and bread."
"Well, well," said Ralph, a little softened, either by his niece's beauty or her distress. Stretch a point and say the latter. "You must try it, and if the life is too hard, perhaps dressmaking or tambour work will come lighter. Have you ever done anything, sir?" turning to his nephew. "No," replied Nicholas bluntly. "No, I thought not," said Ralph. "This is the way my brother brought up his children, ma'am."
"Nicholas has not long completed such education as his poor father could give him," rejoined Mrs. Nickleby, "and he was thinking of—"
"Of making something of him some day," said Ralph. "The old story, always thinking and never doing. If my brother had been a man of activity and prudence, he might have left you a rich woman, ma'am. And if he had turned his son into the world as my father turned me when I wasn't as old as that boy by a year and a half, he would have been in a situation to help you, instead of being a burden upon you and increasing your distress. My brother was a thoughtless, inconsiderate man, Mrs. Nickleby, and nobody, I am sure, can have better reason to feel that than you." This appeal set the widow upon thinking that perhaps she might have made a more successful venture with her £1,000, and then she began to reflect what a comfortable sum it would have been just then, which dismal thoughts made her tears flow faster, and in the excess of these griefs she, being a well-meaning woman enough, but weak withal, fell first deploring her hard fate and then to remarking, with many sobs, that to be sure she had been a slave to poor Nicholas and had often told him she might have married better, as indeed she had very often, and that she never knew in his lifetime how the money went, but that if he had confided in her they might all have been better off that day. With other bitter recollections common to most married ladies, either during their coverture or afterwards or at both periods, Mrs. Nickleby concluded by lamenting that the dear departed had never deigned to profit by her advice, save on one occasion, which was a strictly veracious statement, inasmuch as he had only acted upon it once and had ruined himself in consequence. Mr. Ralph Nickleby heard all this with a half-smile, and when the widow had finished, quietly took up the subject where it had been left before the above outbreak. "Are you willing to work, sir?" he inquired, frowning on his nephew. "Of course I am," replied Nicholas haughtily. "Then see here, sir," said his uncle. "This caught my eye this morning, and you may thank your stars for it." With this exordium, Mr. Ralph Nickleby took a newspaper from his pocket, and after unfolding it and looking for a short time among the advertisements, read as follows: "Education at Mr. Wackford Squeers Academy, Dotheby's Hall, at the delightful village of Dothby's near Greta Bridge in Yorkshire. Youth are boarded, clothed, booked, furnished with pocket money, provided with all necessaries, instructed in all languages, living and dead, mathematics, orthography, geometry, astronomy, trigonometry, the use of the globes, algebra, single stick, if required, writing, arithmetic, fortification, and every other branch of classical literature, Terms 20 guineas per annum. No extras, no vacations, and diet unparalleled. Mr. Squeers is in town and attends daily from 1 till 4 at the Saracen's Head, Snow Hill. N.B. An able assistant wanted. Annual salary £5. A Master of Arts would be preferred. There, said Ralph, folding the paper again. Let him get that situation, and his fortune is made.
But he's not a Master of Arts,
said Mrs. Nickleby. That, replied Ralph, that, I think, can be got over.
But the salary is so small, and it is such a long way off, uncle, faltered Kate. Hush, Kate, my dear, interposed Mrs. Nickleby. Your uncle must know best.
I say, repeated Ralph tartly, let him get that situation and his fortune is made. If he don't like that, let him get one for himself. Without friends, money, recommendation, or knowledge of business of any kind, let him find honest employment in London, which will keep him in shoe-leather, and I'll give him £1,000. At least, said Mr. Ralph Nickleby, checking himself, I would, if I had it.
Poor fellow, said the young lady. Oh, uncle, must we be separated so soon? Don't tease your uncle with questions when he is thinking only for our good, my love, said Mrs. Nickleby. Nicholas, my dear, I wish you would say something.
Yes, mother, yes, said Nicholas, who had hitherto remained silent and absorbed in thought. If I am fortunate enough to be appointed to this post, sir, for which I am so imperfectly qualified, what will become of those I leave behind? Your mother and sister, sir, replied Ralph, will be provided for in that case, not otherwise, by me, and placed in some sphere of life in which they will be able to be independent. That will be my immediate care. They will not remain as they are 1 week after your departure, I will undertake. Then, said Nicholas, starting gaily up and wringing his uncle's hand, I am ready to do anything you wish me. Let us try our fortune with Mr. Squeers at once. He can but refuse. He won't do that, said Ralph. He will be glad to have you on my recommendation. Make yourself of use to him, and you'll rise to be a partner in the establishment in no time. Bless me, only think, if he were to die, why, your fortune's made at once. To be sure, I see it all, said poor Nicholas, delighted with 1,000 visionary ideas that his good spirits and his inexperience were conjuring up before him. Or, suppose some young nobleman who was being educated at the Hall were to take a fancy to me and get his father to appoint me his travelling tutor when he left, and when we come back from the Continent procured me some handsome appointment, eh, uncle? Ah, to be sure, sneered Ralph. And who knows but when he came to see me when I was settled, as he would of course, he might fall in love with Kate, who would be keeping my house, and marry her, eh, uncle? Who knows? Who indeed? Snarled Ralph. How happy we should be! Cried Nicholas with enthusiasm. The pain of parting is nothing to the joy of meeting again. Kate will be a beautiful woman, and I am so proud to hear them say so, and mother so happy to be with us again, and all these sad times forgotten, and the picture was too bright a one to bear, and Nicholas, fairly overpowered by it, smiled faintly and burst into tears. This simple family, born and bred in retirement, and wholly unacquainted with what is called the world, a conventional phrase which, being interpreted, often signifieth all the rascals in it, mingled their tears together at the thought of their first separation, and this first gush of feeling over, were proceeding to dilate with all the buoyancy of untried hope on the bright prospects before them, when Mr. Ralph Nickleby suggested that if they lost time, some more fortunate candidate might deprive Nicholas of the stepping-stone to fortune which the advertisement pointed out, and so undermine all their air-built castles. This timely reminder effectually stopped the conversation. Nicholas, having carefully copied the address of Mr. Squeers, the uncle and nephew issued forth together in quest of that accomplished gentleman. Nicholas firmly persuading himself that he had done his relative great injustice in disliking him at first sight, and Mrs. Nickleby being at some pains to inform her daughter that she was sure he was a much more kindly disposed person than he seemed, which Miss Nickleby dutifully remarked he might very easily be. To tell the truth, the good lady's opinion had been not a little influenced by her brother-in-law's appeal to her better understanding, and his implied compliment to her high deserts, and although she had dearly loved her husband and still doted on her children, he had struck so successfully on one of those little jarring chords in the human heart (Ralph was well acquainted with its worst weaknesses, though he knew nothing of its best) that she had already begun seriously to consider herself the amiable and suffering victim of her late husband's imprudence. Chapter 3